A house divided against itself cannot stand. Those words were spoken by the man who would become America's first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, in a speech to the Illinois Republican State Convention on June 16, 1858. 3 years later, President Lincoln was the commander-in-chief in the war that killed more Americans than any other, our Civil War. Our House has been divided since then over issues like women's right to vote, civil rights, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War. But through all of that, our House has never been divided against itself, to the point that the New York Times and the New Yorker are now running headlines saying, "Is a civil war ahead? Are we really facing a second civil war?" over articles written by our most distinguished journalists and thinkers. And so tonight we begin what will be a series on this program called A House Divided, to offer a range of thoughtful and educated guesses in response to the question, is a civil war ahead? Our first guest is one of the people who started this public discussion with the publication of her new book, How Civil Wars Start. Barbara F. Walter is a professor of international relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. She studied at Harvard's Institute for Strategic Studies and Columbia University's War and Peace Institute. And she served on an advisory committee to the CIA called the Political Instability Task Force. That group ranks countries around the world on a scale with fully functioning democracy at one end and dictatorship at the other end. The United States has always had the highest positive score for democracy, a +10, but it has slipped down the scale recently to a +5. That moved the United States into the zone that this scale calls an anocracy, because it combines elements of a democracy and elements of an autocracy. That kind of political instability is one of the risk factors that CIA analysts use to predict civil war. Joining us now is Professor Barbara F. Walter. She is the author of the important new book, How Civil Wars Start. Professor Walter, thank you very much for joining us tonight and beginning this discussion that we will continue to have on this program, which might involve begging you to come back. One question right off the bat about this score is there an example of a country with a +5 score on that political instability scale that has then fallen into civil war from a +5 score?
Yes. So +5 is the beginning of this middle zone, this zone where a lot of political violence and instability happens. Where it's actually at greatest risk is in the middle, which is between -1 and +1. So if you think, for example, about the wars that are going on today, Ukraine is a country that slipped from being a full democracy into the anocracy zone, and it is currently in a civil war. If you think about Iraq, for example, after the U.S. invasion, when Saddam Hussein was toppled, Iraq went from a fully authoritarian country into this middle zone. The U.S. was hoping to democratize Iraq. It didn't. It didn't succeed initially, and it was during this time in the middle zone when the Civil War broke out there. So yes, we do see examples of it.
And let's define terms, as you do in your writing, about what civil war means now in the 21st century. In your book, you say, if America has a second civil war, the combatants will not gather in fields, nor will they wear uniforms. They will go online to plan their resistance, strategizing how to undermine the government at every level and gain control of parts of America. They will create chaos and fear, and then they will force Americans to pick sides. And so that looks nothing like what we think of as a civil war. There won't be two standing armies. And what else would indicate the kinds of conditions that you're talking about, that you're envisioning, if it ever comes to that?
It's going to be more of what we envision as an insurgency. So it's going to be much more decentralized. It's likely to be fought by multiple different militias, paramilitary groups. Sometimes they'll work together, sometimes they'll be competing with each other. It will look more like what we saw in Northern Ireland for many decades, where the insurgents were using unconventional tactics, terrorism directed at civilians, bombs placed in public places and at buildings, assassination of opposition leaders or judges who are not sympathetic to the insurgents' cause. That's what the new modern civil wars tend to look like.
You also cite other risk factors that for slipping this way. You say one of the other risk factors is a long-standing dominant group, say in this country, white Americans, who fear that they are losing their dominance. Is that what we were seeing on January 6th?
Yeah, so the U.S. is in the midst of this great transformation, and it's a transformation from the U.S. being a white majority country to being a non-white majority country. That's going to happen at about 2045. And one of the things that we've seen throughout history outside the United States is that the groups that tend to start civil wars are not the poorest groups, they're not the immigrants, they're not the groups that are actually the most downtrodden. They're the groups that feel that they're losing power. They're the ones who have this deep sense of resentment. They're the ones who feel like the country is rightfully theirs. They're the ones who still have the residual power capable of organizing and actually launching a challenge. And if you look historically, if you look, for example, at the Palestinians in Israel, if you look at the Catholics in Northern Ireland, if you look at the Moros or the Muslims in the southern Philippines, these are all people who had once been the majority in their regions, who lost that majority status, who lost power, and eventually turned to violence to try to reinstate it.
The Northern Ireland example is something we will talk about in future programs. There are people in Northern Ireland on what is labeled the Catholic side, which is not the most accurate way of labeling these sides,
Yeah.
but they will argue that that was an anti-colonial revolution, which was an extension of a 1916 revolution, and it was simply fought to a stalemate in the later 20th century and doesn't quite fit the model of what we would consider civil war, but we'll come back to that later. I want to go to the South Africa example, which you've talked about and is fascinating. And again, with the South Africa example, given that you describe modern civil war as something of an insurgency, did South Africa avoid a civil war, or did South Africa actually have a civil war in the form of a violent insurgency, an insurgency that was at times violent, that then convinced the white dominant tiny minority to, in effect, surrender in that civil war and surrender power to the vast African population there?
Yeah, experts do not consider what happened in South Africa as civil war. In fact, when you ask them about South Africa, they will say that was the country where they most expected a civil war, large amounts of violence. They actually thought South Africa would be just destroyed as a result. And it avoided it. And people point to South Africa as an example of what to do when you're in a situation like this. You had the white minority regime, the apartheid regime. It desperately wanted to hold on to power. You have this very large black majority that has been protesting for years, that is increasing its protests, that is shifting from a nonviolent protest strategy to a violent protest strategy. And still the white minority regime doesn't reform or compromise in any way. In fact, it ratchets up the violence. If you remember Soweto, when the military went in and just murdered over 100 children, this was the direction they were going. And we thought, the experts thought for sure, we're going to have civil war here. The black majority is just so numerous. They're just not going to stand for this. And then the white minority regime shifted. And the reason isn't because they suddenly had, gained a conscience. It was because the white business community was slowly being strangled by very effective economic sanctions. And it was the white business community, in part, that realized that they had to make a choice. They could either have profits or they could have apartheid, but they couldn't have both. And ultimately, they chose profits, and they told the white minority regime that they were no longer going to support apartheid. And it didn't take very long after that for the government to transfer power to the black majority.